Hello buddy, welcome to Boxing Science. In this video, I'm going to be covering a very important subject, something that all boxers have to do, is return to training camp. I'm going to be sharing my top 5 tips and considerations to make sure that an athlete is working on the right things, making tweaks in the right areas to make sure that they have the best possible start to camp. So what are the key considerations to make when a boxer is returning to training camp? You've got to consider their increase in body mass. So boxers have been off the diet, they've been sitting about, less active, so they're going to come in with increased body mass. This can cause problems in terms of like plyometrics, punch-specific exercises, and high-intensity running. So you need to make sure you adapt these things to adapt around the increased body mass. Increase in training load, they've been doing nothing, zilch. So we need to make sure that the increase in training load is steady to make sure that we're not pushing our athletes too hard too soon. Increased soreness, if you ever do like your first session back, let's say you do leg day after do some squats, first time in a while, you're not going to be able to walk properly the next day. So you've got to make some key considerations about lifts that you use to try and reduce soreness. We need to make sure that we're stimulating our athlete. We need to make sure that when they're getting into the gym, they're feeling like they're getting some sort of training adaptation, psychologically and physiologically. You might only have a short training camp. Let's say you only have 10 weeks. You need to make sure that you're doing something constructive, something that's going to be promoting adaptations, instead of just going too light. Thinking about these considerations here, going really too light, you can do a few different things to make some tweaks to make sure that you're still targeting physical adaptations, you're still making it quite challenging for the athlete, and again, building a strong foundation for your training camp. So tip number 1, plyometrics. Using this in a functional way to support the early stages of training camp, but also to provide a strong foundation for explosive performance later on in the training camp. Braking forces, landing mechanics works. This will provide the foundations for more intensive plyometrics in the future, but also is preparing our tendons, our ligaments, our joints to be exposed to high impact forces, whether that's high intensity running or boxing. So doing stuff like altitude landings, doing some ice skaters, some banded ice skaters, working on some braking forces. These are ideal to use during the first phases of training camp. As well, we've got low intensity plyometrics. So the braking force is quite high intensity, but we haven't got that concentric action. So being able to control that. With normal plyometrics, when you're working from eccentric action to concentric action, this can be too intensive for early on, especially when we're going with increased body mass. We go for low intensity plyometrics, stuff like low pogos, slaloms, to reduce that contact time, to work on reactive strength without exposing our athletes to high amounts of forces to be able to control and then reproduce into plyometric action. Number 2 are variations of strength exercises with the key goal in mind to reduce load and reduce eccentric stress. So we've said here that an athlete is going to be increasing their training load. So we're not wanting to get our athlete starting off training camp 100, 120, 140 kilo trap bar deadlift straight away. These excessive forces through the spine can be a big jump in training load and something that our athlete, might potentially get injured as well. Soreness. So doing stuff like squats, heavy loaded squats, when we first start in training camp, this can end up with our athletes feeling sore. When they're sore and fatigued going into boxing, this is when injuries can happen. So we need to create some variations to reduce the load and reduce the eccentric stress. So we can use regressions. A good exercise to use, goblet squat with bands, doing a sumo deadlift with bands. Sumo deadlift in particular, compared to the trap bar deadlift, you can use a sumo deadlift with bands and can get a load. So we're using it with Terry today. We're using 20 kilos, around about 40 kilos of force at the end range. Compare that to a deadlift for 8 repetitions, Terry would probably be able to 90 or 100 kilos. And think about them shear forces going through the spine, going through the joints from 100 kilos compared to 40 kilos. So you can see there that an athlete is still getting stimulated, still working on that rep range to improve strength and strength endurance. We're eliminating that risk of a heavy loaded trap bar deadlift. Using pauses, this can increase the intensity of an exercise at the bottom of the lift. So for example, a goblet squat, we use a goblet squat with a pause. Sometimes we're mini bands as well. And this reduces the amount of weight that an athlete can lift, but is increasing intensity and the effort on the way up. Particularly important for exercises that have a high eccentric loading, stuff like goblet squats. You know, Terry would probably be able to do a goblet squat of 35 kilos, but instead we're using 22.5 kilos instead. Adding that pause in there, we'll still be working strength adaptations, but we're reducing that eccentric loading. Using isometrics, a way to promote strength adaptations, some neuromuscular adaptations without the eccentric loading at all. Then increasing the complexity of an exercise, particularly for upper body pressing, for your single leg exercises, doing something a little bit more complex to stimulate your athlete, but do it under less load. So with Terry today, we're doing a lunge overhead press. The overhead press is between 7.5 and 10 kilos. This is a lot less than what you'd be doing from just a normal shoulder press, and also a lot less on the lower body. So when she normally does lunges, probably be like 20 kilos in each hand. She's finding this quite challenging with 7.5 to 10 kilos. These are a few different ways that you can vary up your strength exercises to reduce the load, reduce the eccentric stress, but making sure that we're promoting adaptations and stimulating our athlete. Tip number 3, blood flow restriction. This helps reduce the load significantly. For a compound lift, set around about 30% 1 rep max, but for isolated lifts such as bicep curls, tricep extension, lateral raises, targeting the upper limb with reduced load. So this will reduce the eccentric stress, reduce the stress on the tendons, whilst increasing the conditioning stimulus for the muscle. This is really important, building them foundations for a training camp, building some muscular hypertrophy. Basically, we're getting faster results with less effort. So we're being really efficient. This is what we need to be in our boxing training camp. Tip number 4, adding some extra mobility drills to make sure that athlete is moving well before they start increasing their training loads. Most athletes will be like sitting down a lot more, not doing their mobility drills. So them imbalances that I've been working on in the training camp might slip back in. So if they're quite tight around the shoulders or tight in rotation, because they haven't been doing it as much, if you don't use it, you might lose it. So you need to make sure that we're increasing the range of motion, making sure that we're balancing out them imbalances before we start increasing that training load. And the main ones that we need to work on is rotation, hip mobility, and then firing up the glutes. The 5th and final tip is around your conditioning. So what we like to do at Boxing Science in the first 2 weeks is to do recovery runs. But if you go too hard too soon on your conditioning, this increases the likelihood of injury, illness, and fatigue. We do a tempo run. It builds up the volume. We're making sure that we're varying that intensity. So we're getting used to running at higher speeds, but not doing this at a fatiguing level. And also we need to make sure that we're doing it for a lengthy amount of time, so we're burning enough calories, so we try and reduce this body mass before we go into more intensive runs. So the run that we're going to do with Terry today consists of various intervals. We're increasing the speed as we go along, but we're always looking for that green zone. So that's between 70 and 80% of the maximum heart rate. This makes sure that they're underneath their lactate threshold to make sure that they're working predominantly aerobically and they're not working in no man's land. Okay, so they're my top 5 tips for returning to training camp. If anybody wants any help with this in terms of rep ranges and exercises that are more suitable to you, why don't you check out some of our bespoke programs? The link is in the description. And if you like this video, hit the like button. If not a subscriber yet, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content.